What happens when royal privilege collides head-first with American television's sharpest tongue? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry thought he could waltz onto The Late Show and control the narrative, only to discover that Stephen Colbert doesn't bow to anyone, not even royalty. Last night's episode delivered the most explosive confrontation in late-night television history, culminating in a dramatic walkout that left the studio audience in stunned silence and producers scrambling to cut to commercial. The tension was palpable from the moment Prince Harry stepped onto the Ed Sullivan Theatre stage. What was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance for his latest memoir turned into a masterclass in how not to handle American media scrutiny. The warning signs were there from the opening moments. Harry's stiff posture, the way he avoided eye contact during the pre-interview pleasantries, and most telling of all, the visible frustration that flickered across his face when Colbert's opening monologue included a particularly pointed joke about royal family dysfunction. As the cameras rolled and the familiar Late Show theme music faded, Colbert launched into his standard warm welcome, but even seasoned viewers could detect something different in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Prince Harry," he announced, but there was an edge to his smile that suggested this wouldn't be the softball interview Harry's handlers had clearly negotiated for. Harry settled into the guest chair with the kind of practiced ease that comes from years of media training, but his body language told a different story. His shoulders remained rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, and when Colbert made his first attempt at light-hearted banter about the weather in New York, Harry's response was clipped and mechanical. "Yes, quite different from California," he replied, already seeming annoyed that small talk was part of the process. The first real crack in Harry's composure came when Colbert, with his trademark raised eyebrow, asked about the timing of Harry's latest book release. "Interesting timing for another tell-all memoir," Colbert observed, leaning back in his chair with that deceptively casual posture that regular viewers know means he's about to strike. "Some might say the royal family has been through enough public scrutiny lately. Any particular reason you felt now was the right moment to add more fuel to that fire?" Harry's jaw tightened visibly. "I think that's a rather unfair characterization, Stephen. This book is about healing and moving forward, not dwelling on the past," but his voice carried a defensive edge that made it clear Colbert had hit a nerve. "Healing?" Colbert repeated, drawing out the word with theatrical consideration. "That's interesting, because from what I've read in the advance excerpts, there's quite a bit of dwelling on perceived slights and family grievances. Help me understand how relitigating old wounds in print contributes to this healing process you're describing." The studio audience, initially warm and welcoming, began to sense the shift in atmosphere. Conversations that had started as friendly exchanges were taking on the character of a cross-examination, with Colbert's questions becoming more pointed, and Harry's responses growing more guarded and irritated. "Look," Harry said, his accent becoming more pronounced as his frustration mounted, "I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here about what this book represents. This isn't about relitigating anything. This is about setting the record straight and sharing my truth about experiences that have been misrepresented by the British media for years." Colbert nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't buying what Harry was selling. "Your truth," he said, emphasizing the possessive pronoun. "That's a phrase that's come up a lot in your recent interviews. But I'm curious, when you say your truth, are you acknowledging that there might be other equally valid perspectives on these same events? Or are you suggesting that your version is the definitive account of what happened?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Harry's response revealed just how unprepared he was for this level of intellectual sparring. His media training had clearly focused on friendly American outlets and sympathetic interviewers, not someone who would dissect his talking points with surgical precision. "I think," Harry began, his voice rising slightly, "that anyone who lived through these experiences would have a pretty clear understanding of what actually happened versus what was reported or spin-doctored for public consumption." But Colbert wasn't finished. So you're saying the British press got it wrong? Your family's version of events is incorrect, and you're the sole arbiter of truth in these situations? That's quite a responsibility to take on, don't you think? Harry's composure was beginning to crack in earnest now. His hands unclenched and he leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on a harder edge. I'm saying that I lived through it, Stephen. I was there for every conversation, every slight, every moment when I was treated as less than by the very people who should have protected me. So yes, I think I have a pretty good handle on what my truth is. The phrase less than seemed to trigger something in Colbert, who straightened in his chair and fixed Harry with a look that made it clear the gloves were coming off. Less than, he repeated, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that longtime viewers recognize as the moment before Colbert delivers a devastating blow. That's interesting phrasing from someone who was born into unimaginable privilege, given every advantage in life, and whose biggest hardship seems to be that he wasn't treated like he was special enough. The studio fell silent. Even the production crew, visible in the background, seemed to freeze as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Harry's face flushed red, and for a moment it looked like he might actually walk off the set right then and there. But instead, he composed himself just enough to deliver what he clearly thought would be a devastating comeback. You know what, Stephen? I think this conversation says more about your character than mine. I came here in good faith to have a respectful discussion, and instead I'm being ambushed with gotcha questions and personal attacks. Colbert's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. Personal attacks? I asked you to explain your own words and defend your own actions. If that feels like an attack, maybe the problem isn't with the questions, and that's when Harry made the fatal mistake that would define the rest of this disastrous interview. Instead of backing down or trying to find common ground, he doubled down with the kind of entitled outrage that would seal his fate on American television. His next words would transform what had been a tense but manageable interview into an all-out confrontation that nobody in that studio would ever forget. You know what your problem is, Stephen? Harry said, his voice dripping with condescension as he pointed directly at his host. You sit here behind your desk making jokes about people's pain because you've never had to deal with real consequences for anything in your life. You mock and belittle from your safe little bubble while other people actually live through trauma and try to heal from it. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Colbert's expression shifted from amusement to something much darker, and veteran late-show watchers could practically feel the temperature drop 10 degrees. This wasn't just poor judgment from Harry. This was a direct attack on Colbert's character, delivered with the kind of sneering superiority that Americans instinctively despise. Real consequences, Colbert repeated slowly, his voice taking on that dangerous quiet tone that preceded his most brutal takedowns. You want to talk about real consequences? Let's talk about real consequences, Your Highness. Let's talk about what happens when someone who's never worked a day in their life, never worried about paying rent, never had to choose between groceries and medicine, lectures working people about trauma and healing. Harry's face went pale, but he was too far down this path to turn back now. That's exactly the kind of ignorant assumption I'm talking about. You have no idea what I've been through, what my family has put me through, what I've sacrificed. Sacrificed? Colbert interrupted, his voice rising for the first time in the interview. You sacrificed what, exactly? Your multi-million-dollar Netflix deal? Your mansion in Montecito? Your book advances? Help me understand what you've given up here, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've turned family drama into a very lucrative business model. The studio audience, which had been uncomfortably silent, began to murmur. Some nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, but it was the kind of laughter that comes when people witness something they know they shouldn't be seeing. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a public evisceration. Harry's composure completely shattered. He leaned forward aggressively, his voice rising to match Colbert's intensity. You want to know what I've sacrificed? I've sacrificed My relationship with my father. I've sacrificed my relationship with my brother. I've had to give up my military titles, my patronages, everything I worked for, because I refused to stay silent while they destroyed my wife and tried to destroy me. And whose fault is that? Colbert shot back without missing a beat. Because from what I've read, you had a choice. You could have stayed, worked within the system, tried to change things from the inside. Instead, you chose to burn it all down, cash in on the drama, and then play the victim when people called you out for it. The confrontation had crossed a line that both men seemed to recognize, but neither was willing to step back from. Harry's hands were shaking now, whether from rage or adrenaline, and his voice took on a desperate edge that made it clear he was losing control of the situation. "You don't understand what it's like to be trapped in that system," Harry said, his accent thickening with emotion. "You don't understand what it's like to watch the woman you love be torn apart by vicious press coverage while your own family feeds the beast. You don't understand what it's like to realize that the institution you've served your entire life values its image more than your happiness or your mental health." Colbert's response was swift and merciless. "You're right. I don't understand that. But you know what I do understand? I understand what it's like to lose a parent tragically and not spend the next 25 years blaming everyone else for how that affected me. I understand what it's like to face criticism and adversity without running away and writing tell-all books about it. The reference to Diana's death was like throwing gasoline on a fire." Harry's eyes flashed with genuine anger, and when he spoke, his voice was barely controlled. "Don't you dare bring my mother into this. Don't you dare minimize what happened to her or what that did to our family." "I'm not minimizing anything," Colbert replied, his tone now coldly professional. "I'm pointing out that tragedy doesn't give you a lifetime pass to hurt other people. Your mother's death was terrible, but it doesn't justify spending decades airing your family's private business for profit." Harry stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the stunned studio. For a moment, it looked like he might actually take a swing at Colbert, who remained seated but visibly tensed. "You know what?" Harry said, his voice shaking with fury. "I don't have to sit here and take this abuse from someone who's built his career on mocking people who can't fight back. This isn't journalism. This is a hit job." Colbert stood up slowly, matching Harry's aggressive posture. "A hit job? I asked you basic questions about your own public statements and your own published words. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be writing books and giving interviews." The two men stood facing each other across the desk, the tension so thick that crew members began moving closer, clearly worried about where this was heading. Harry's publicist, visible in the wings, was frantically gesturing, but Harry was beyond listening to anyone at this point. "This interview is over," Harry declared, his voice carrying across the silent studio. "I won't be disrespected like this on national television by someone who's never accomplished anything more significant than reading jokes off a teleprompter." The insult was perfectly calculated to inflict maximum damage, attacking not just Colbert's professional credentials but his entire identity as a performer and commentator. The host's face went completely white, then flushed red with an anger that was clearly genuine. But what happened next would prove that Harry had badly miscalculated just how dangerous Stephen Colbert could be when truly provoked. "Reading jokes off a teleprompter," Colbert repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. The studio had gone so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed deafening. "You think that's what this is? You think comedy is just reading words someone else wrote?" Harry, still standing and clearly committed to his aggressive stance, sneered. "Isn't it? When was the last time you did anything that required actual courage? When was the last time you put yourself on the line for something that mattered?" The question was a catastrophic miscalculation. Colbert's entire demeanor shifted, his performer's mask dropping completely to reveal something raw and genuinely dangerous underneath. When he spoke, His voice carried the weight of years of experience, loss, and hard-won wisdom that Harry's privileged upbringing had never provided him. "Courage?" Colbert said, stepping around his desk with predatory grace. "You want to talk about courage? Let me tell you about courage, Prince. Courage is getting up every single day after your father and 2 brothers died in a plane crash and finding a way to make people laugh despite your own pain. Courage is building a career from nothing, not having it handed to you by birthright." Harry's face went ashen. He clearly hadn't expected Colbert to invoke his own family tragedy, and the comparison was devastating. "That's completely different." "Is it?" Colbert interrupted, his voice rising again. "Because from where I stand it looks like we both lost family members tragically. The difference is I didn't spend the next 3 decades writing books about how everyone else was responsible for my pain. I didn't turn my grief into a brand." The studio audience gasped audibly. Several crew members exchanged worried glances, and Harry's publicist was now frantically waving from the wings, clearly desperate to end this disaster before it got any worse. But both men were beyond stopping now. Harry's response revealed just how cornered he felt. "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand the pressures I was under, the impossible situation I was put in. Everything I've done has been about protecting my family and telling the truth." "Protecting your family?" Colbert's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Which family are we talking about here? Because it seems like you've done everything possible to destroy your relationship with the family that raised you, while constantly playing the victim about how they treated you." Harry took a step closer to Colbert, his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't lecture me about family loyalty. You have no idea what they put me through, what they put Meghan through. The racism, the isolation, the deliberate campaign to destroy us." "Stop," Colbert said sharply, holding up a hand. "Just stop. You keep talking about what they did to you, but what about what you've done to them? What about dragging your grandmother's name through the mud while she was dying? What about exposing private conversations with your father and brother to millions of people? Where's your accountability in all of this?" The accusation hit Harry like a physical blow. His face flushed, red with anger and something that looked uncomfortably like shame. "You don't understand the context." "The context?" Colbert's voice was incredulous. "The context is that you've made millions of dollars airing your family's dirty laundry while claiming to be the victim. The context is that you've turned personal grievances into public entertainment while lecturing everyone else about privacy and respect." Harry was visibly trembling now, whether from rage or humiliation. His voice cracked as he responded. "I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to be in this position. All I wanted was to live a normal life with my wife and children." "Then why didn't you?" Colbert shot back mercilessly. "Why didn't you just leave quietly and build that normal life? Why the Netflix deals? And the book contracts? And the constant interviews? Why turn your exit into a 3-year media circus if all you wanted was privacy?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, and Harry's response revealed the depth of his delusion. "Because they wouldn't let me go quietly. They kept attacking us in the press, kept trying to control the narrative." "So you decided to control it yourself," Colbert finished. "You decided that your version of events was the only one that mattered, and anyone who disagreed with you was part of some conspiracy against you. Do you hear yourself? Do you understand how that sounds to people who live in the real world?" Harry's composure finally shattered completely. His voice rose to nearly a shout. "The real world? You want to talk about the real world? I served 2 tours in Afghanistan while you were making jokes on television. I've seen real combat, real sacrifice." "And there it is," Colbert said quietly, but his words cut through Harry's outburst like a blade. "When all else fails, you fall back on your military service. As if that gives you immunity from criticism for everything else you've done. As if being a soldier means you can't also be wrong, or selfish, or hypocritical. The studio was so quiet now that the sound of Harry's heavy breathing was audible throughout the theater. His hands were shaking, and sweat was visible on his forehead despite the studio's air conditioning. He looked like a man who had just realized he was drowning and had no idea how to save himself. "You know what your real problem is?" Colbert continued, his voice now conversational but no less devastating. "You've never had to face real consequences for your actions. You've never had to truly apologize for anything or take responsibility for the damage you've caused. You just move on to the next interview, the next book deal, the next opportunity to play the victim." Harry's response was barely coherent, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "You don't understand anything about my life or my choices. You sit here in your comfortable little bubble making judgments about people you've never met, situations you've never experienced." "Actually," Colbert interrupted with deadly calm, "I think I understand perfectly. You're a man who had everything handed to him and threw it all away because you couldn't handle not being the center of attention. And now you're angry that the rest of us won't pretend that makes you a hero." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Harry stood frozen for a moment, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a response that wouldn't further expose his own contradictions and self-deceptions. And in that moment of stunned silence, something shifted in the room that made it clear this confrontation was about to reach its explosive conclusion. When Harry finally spoke, his voice was barely controlled, shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation that made everyone in the studio acutely uncomfortable. "You know what, Stephen? You're absolutely right about one thing. I don't have to sit here and take this humiliation from you or anyone else. I came here thinking I was dealing with a professional, but clearly I was wrong." Colbert's smile was cold as winter steel. "Oh, you want to talk about professionalism? Let's talk about the professionalism of ambushing your own family in print, of violating their privacy for profit, of turning personal conversations into public spectacle. That's your idea of professional behavior?" Harry's last thread of self-control snapped completely. He slammed his hand down on Colbert's desk with such force that his microphone jumped, creating a sharp feedback screech that made the entire studio wince. "Enough! I don't have to justify my choices to you or anyone else. I protected my wife and children from a toxic system that would have destroyed them. By destroying everyone else instead?" Colbert fired back instantly. "By making sure your father, your brother, your stepmother all became casualties in your personal war against accountability? That's protection? That's heroism?" The studio audience was now visibly uncomfortable, with several people covering their faces or looking away from the carnage unfolding before them. This had gone far beyond entertainment into something genuinely ugly and personal. Harry's publicist had given up trying to signal from the wings and was now frantically speaking into her phone, clearly calling for security or legal intervention. Harry's response revealed the true depth of his entitlement and delusion. "My father chose the institution over his own son. My brother chose his position over our relationship. They made their choices, and I made mine. The difference is, I was honest about it." "Honest?" Colbert's voice dripped with contempt. "You call it honest to wait until your grandmother was on her deathbed to publish the most damaging accusations? You call it honest to record private conversations and then use them as ammunition? You call it honest to play the victim while cashing million-dollar checks?" Harry was completely unhinged now, his voice rising to a near shout that echoed through the studio. "You have no idea what it's like to be trapped in that gilded cage. No idea what it's like to watch the woman you love be systematically destroyed while your own family stands by and does nothing. And you have no idea what it's like to work for a living," Colbert roared back, his own composure finally cracking completely. "You have no idea what it's like to face real consequences, real struggles, real problems that can't be solved by running away to California and signing Netflix deals." The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Both men were now standing, facing each other across the desk like gladiators in an arena, their faces flushed with anger and adrenaline. The studio crew was frozen, unsure whether to intervene or simply document what was clearly going to be television history. Harry's final gambit was to play the victim one last time, but his delivery was so desperate and unconvincing that it only made him look more pathetic. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "This is the kind of abuse and disrespect that drove me away from everything I knew. This is why I had to protect my family." Colbert's response was swift and final. "No. This is what happens when someone finally holds you accountable for your actions. This is what happens when you can't control the narrative or play the victim card. This is reality, Your Highness, and you clearly can't handle it." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Harry stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, his hands shaking with rage and humiliation. The studio was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Then, without warning, Harry exploded into motion. He ripped off his lapel microphone with such violence that the cord snapped, threw it down on Colbert's desk, and pointed an accusatory finger directly at his host's face. "This is over. I won't be treated like this by anyone, especially not by some two-bit comedian who thinks he's a journalist." Colbert remained seated, his expression now one of calm satisfaction. "There it is," he said quietly, but his voice carried throughout the silent studio. "There's the real Prince Harry. Not the victim, not the humanitarian, not the wounded son. Just another entitled rich kid who can't handle being told no." Harry's face went purple with rage. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the studio exit, his publicist scrambling to follow him. But just before he reached the door, he turned back one final time, his voice carrying across the stunned theater. "You'll regret this, Stephen. You'll regret embarrassing me on national television. This isn't over." The threat hung in the air like smoke as Harry disappeared through the exit, his publicist trailing behind him like a nervous shadow. The studio remained frozen in shocked silence for several seconds before Colbert slowly turned back to face the camera. His smile was genuine now, the first real smile he'd shown all evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice perfectly calm and professional. "Prince Harry, everyone. We'll be right back after these messages." As the cameras cut to commercial, the studio erupted in a mixture of nervous laughter, excited chatter, and stunned disbelief. Crew members immediately began reviewing the footage, knowing they had just captured something extraordinary. Colbert remained at his desk, straightening his tie and looking remarkably composed for someone who had just destroyed a member of the British royal family on live television. The Late Show had seen many memorable moments over the years, but nothing had ever come close to the complete public meltdown they had just witnessed. Prince Harry had walked into that studio thinking he could control the narrative one more time, but instead he had revealed himself to be exactly what Colbert had accused him of being: an entitled, self-absorbed man-child who couldn't handle the consequences of his own actions. As news of the confrontation began to spread across social media and entertainment news outlets, one thing became crystal clear. Prince Harry's American media rehabilitation tour was officially over, ended by his own spectacular inability to handle basic accountability. The prince, who had spent years playing the victim, had finally met someone who refused to play along, and the results were nothing short of devastating.